All right, so we've seen how to write a class component, but I did mention that there's another type of component, which is a function component. So a class component is the traditional way of writing components. You write your logic in a JavaScript class, there must be a render method, and it needs to return something. You can also write a component using a function. So historically, these have been used for dumb components, simple components that don't have much logic, that aren't changing a whole lot. They were usually simple, not necessarily static. It's kind of hard to go into until we talk about things like props and state, but they just didn't have the same capabilities of class components. So you would write your logic in a JavaScript function, and there is no render method. There are no methods at all. It's just a single function, and you return some content, and that content will be rendered. So if we hop over here, where we have our old component from the last video, which is class-based, we could rewrite the whole thing. I'll just comment this first one out, and I'll add in function hello, like that, and then we return something. And then I'll grab this right here and just paste it in right there. And this is going to be equivalent to this. So you can see this is definitely shorter, it's simpler, but we'll talk about why we're not going to use these as often in the course, at least until the end. But first, let's make sure it works. So let me open this up with my live server. Open with live server. All right, so it works just the same way. Now, what's the real difference here? Well, in a situation like what we have in this page here, or this component where it's just some static elements, then you don't need to use a class component. You can get away with a function component. However, historically, there was lots of things you couldn't do with a function component. So we haven't talked about things like state or lifecycle methods, but traditionally you could only use these state, lifecycle methods, and a couple other things. You could only write them inside of a class-based component. So functional components were simple, dumb, that's a word a lot of people use, I'm not just using that myself, components that were not as complicated as class-based components. However, that has started to change with the introduction of React hooks. React hooks allow you to write full-featured function-based components that work basically the same way as a class-based component. There are some major differences though around syntax. The way it works is very different, the code you write is very different, but rest assured, we are going to learn all of that later on in the course. We talk a lot about hooks, a lot about functional components. But for now, what we're going to do is stick with the conventional class-based components. So what we learned in the last video, for most of our components, we'll throw in a couple of function components where it makes sense, but for the most part, we'll be writing classes. And one of the reasons I'm doing this is so that you don't have to worry about two syntaxes at the same time. We'll just stick to class-based components until we pivot over to hooks. So to summarize everything here, there are two ways to write your components, using a class and using a function. In a function, you just return content. In a class, you have an explicit render method. My indentation got a little messed up, and your render returns your content. Historically, in the earlier days of React, up until basically 2019, class components were more powerful, they had more features. They're still way more common than function-based components. Things are changing though. Function components now can take advantage of something called React hooks to replicate the functionality of traditional class components. So we will be learning that, but for now we're putting this away. We're not going to worry about functions as much. We're sticking to class-based components. All right, so only worry about this syntax. Next, we're going to talk about how you get your resources for this course, all the important things you need to download, and then we're going to hone in on JSX, what is going on here.